So first, this is just a real quick intro, just in case you're not familiar with who we are. So we are Seed St. Louis. If you knew Gateway Greening, we're the same people. Same thing. We just changed our name. But we are essentially a support organization whose purpose is to provide the community with the education, resources, and the network to grow their own food. So we currently support a network of 230. That number is a little old. Projects across the region. I believe it's 250 now is our official count. We provide one-on-one staff consultation. We provide volunteers, tool loan program, access to garden and orchard supplies to those kind of network projects that we work with, those 250 groups around the region. And then to the broader community, we sell low-cost seeds, organic garden and orchard supplies, specially selected vegetable seedlings that we contract grow with the horticulture program at the community college, and then with a local farm in Godfrey, Illinois. We run a demonstration garden. We teach lots of classes like the one tonight. We also have an annual conference that will be coming up at the beginning of March that will be virtual and in person, depending on how everything looks by March. And those are all available to the general public. And we also, just starting this year, have a backyard gardener program. So if you like our resources, keep an eye out for that. We're in the middle of the first cohort right now. So hopefully sometime this year, we'll be announcing what that program will look like going into the future. So for seedlings, I always like to start out my classes by doing a little bit of definitions just to make sure we're all on the same page. So what is a seedling? So it's essentially just a young plant that is grown from seed is generally what we're talking about. For the purposes of this class, we're specifically talking about one that you grow in a controlled environment in order to transplant somewhere else at a later date. So usually like outside on a later date. We are generally not talking about a plant that is propagated by cuttings or vegetatively. So at the very end, I'll briefly touch on if we have time, but this general information is not covering things like potatoes, sweet potatoes, things like rooting cuttings, grafting. Those things are really helpful and are sometimes necessary for those plants, but those are not really like seedlings in the sense that we'll be talking about very much tonight. So why grow a seedling? Why grow something inside and then move it outside instead of just planting it outside to begin with? One of the reasons is to get an early start. So if you are able to start the plant earlier because you start it inside whenever it would be too cold outside to start it, you might be able to get an earlier harvest because the plant is more mature at the beginning of the outdoor season. For crops that you can harvest more than once, something like a tomato where you harvest and then once they start producing, they keep producing until frost. By getting them started earlier, you could have a longer and or larger harvest over the course of the season. One of the reasons that I like to do seedlings is that it can help you learn what a plant looks like that you're not familiar with. If there's like a new plant that you're growing, sometimes planting it outside in the garden, and then it germinates and it can be kind of hard to tell, is that a weed? Is that the thing I planted? If you don't really know what the plant looks like. So growing it inside in a pot can help you kind of become accustomed to what that plant is supposed to look like. It can also increase your chances of success if something is slower growing or has low germination rate. Because again, it's easier to control like weeds inside versus outside. If you plant it and it's really slow to grow and you have a whole bunch of weeds growing, it might be kind of lost in the weeds. If you have really rare seed, like if you get something and it's like, oh, I've only got like 4 seeds of this or something weird, it's a good way to kind of like hedge your bets and make sure that those 4 are gonna produce something. It can also help with succession planting. So if you're wanting to do like a spring crop and then a summer crop and then a fall crop, seedlings can be particularly helpful for growing fall crops because your like summer crops can keep growing for longer if your fall things are starting in a pot and then you're able to move it outside. And there's some plants like melons are the main one where they really like kind of more sandy soils than we tend to have here. And germinating them is particularly difficult in clay soils. And so if you're able to start them inside in like more of a sandy soil, you sometimes have better luck with melons than if you direct seeded them outside. So then why not to grow seedlings. There's some people who just love seedlings and think that you should have seedlings for everything. But there's plenty of reasons not to do seedlings. One is if it's not necessary or helpful. So there's some plants like those listed there. They tend to be things that are pretty fast growing when they're young. They tend to have pretty large seeds, just as a general rule. And you usually don't get much benefit from growing a seedling from those because they grow so quickly when they're young that the kind of transplant shock that you get when you take something that you started as a seedling and put it in the ground, you kind of lose all the time advantage that you would have gotten. So there's not much of an advantage to growing things like squash, cucumbers, beans, peas, corn, okra, and other kind of large seeded things other than melons. Some plants just don't like to be transplanted. So a lot of root crops don't really like it, especially carrots. It can still be done. I know people who do it, but the plants don't really like it. They tend to do better on average when they're planted directly in the ground. Or also if you don't want to or aren't able to, you don't have to do seedlings. There's a lot of crops that you might have better luck with as doing seedlings, but there's very few that you have to do as seedlings. Things like onions, Brussels sprouts, eggplants, and peppers are among those that like you really kind of have to. Other things like I do tomatoes direct seeded because I just hate doing tomato seedlings. And as long as you get one that's really fast growing, it'll still work. You're just not going to get as high of a yield, things like that. So this is just a list of some of the ones that we usually recommend you doing seedlings from. They're the ones that you tend to have the biggest kind of advantage from doing a seedling versus direct seedling. And for the most part, it is your brassicas. So things like collards, kale, cabbage, kohlrabi, cauliflower, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, bok choy, tatsoi, things like that. The solanaceous crops, so like the eggplant, the pepper that we talked about, tomatoes on average do better as seedlings here. Tomatillos, ground cherries, the onion family, onions and leeks, and then most herbs. So the ones with the asterisks here are ones that generally you're propagating by division, like where you're kind of digging them up and separating them, as opposed to doing them from seed. But if you are going to do them from seed, it's much better to do them as a seedling. So for growing seedlings, you're going to need some materials. You're going to need seeds, the thing that you want to grow. You're going to need a seed starting medium. So like what we think of as soil, although it's not soil in the classic sense. You're going to need some sort of container for holding plants. So like pots or some sort of pot replacement. You're going to want a tray to catch water, something to put under the pots because they do have to have drainage holes. You're going to need a source of light. You're going to need a source of fertility. And then kind of optional things that can be helpful depending on what you're growing, but are not essential are heat mats and humidity domes. So first, we can talk about seed starting medium. So there's a lot of different options to choose from in terms of what that kind of soil material is that you're going to be growing in. There's seed starting mix, which is usually like a loose kind of bagged soil-like material that you could be planting in. Pellets are something that a lot of people like. So this is, what pellets look like. They're those flat little pellets and you get them wet and they kind of expand and make into like little pot kind of things. There are some homemade options. So you can make like your own seed starting mix that you don't buy pre-made from the store. There's also soil blocks. So I do not have a whole lot of experience with soil blocks. I know that there's some people who absolutely love them. But it's kind of like a whole different beast. So for the most part, we're not going to talk about the specifics of soil blocks, but just know that that is an option that you can explore. But you do need some like special equipment to make the blocks of soil. The most important thing to know though is that it is not garden soil. When we're talking about seed starting medium or seed starting mix, we are not talking about like going out into your garden, digging up some soil from your raised beds and putting them in pots. Seed starting mix is generally much lighter. It is also a lot more free draining and it's usually sterile. It's not, again, strictly speaking, soil. There's usually not a mineral component. It's usually just a really fluffy material that helps seeds to germinate very quickly and helps keep moisture, like where it'll hold moisture, but it's not saturated to avoid fungal issues and root rots that can be a big issue inside. And so using these versus trying to use just like normal garden soil, usually means you're going to have fewer disease issues growing your seedlings. You're going to have a faster growth rate, and you're not going to have weeds because it's not soil. There's not weeds in it. And so you know that if something germinates, it's what you planted, which can be really helpful if you're growing seedlings so that you know what a plant looks like. Most are going to be based on peat moss. And so then just a quick little side note about peat moss. Peat moss is by far the most common thing that you will find seed starting mixes made out of. And if it's all you can find, obviously do what you got to do. But peat moss is not is not an ideal substance for seed starting. Peat moss actually doesn't like to hold water once it gets dry. And so it needs to have a wetting agent added to it so that it will absorb water to begin with. It's also very acidic. It's a great soil for blueberries and like azaleas and stuff, but it's not real great for most vegetables. And so it usually has something in it to temper the pH that needs to be added, which are both things that are doable. One of the big things that's been getting attention recently, though, as people have been looking at it, is one of the big problems with peat is that peat bogs, which is where peat is mined from, are enormous carbon sinks. And the harvesting of peat disrupts their ability to store carbon, and it releases carbon into the atmosphere. And when I say enormous, I mean peat bogs cover 3% of the world's land surface, and it holds 30% of all soil carbon on the planet, which is more than all living plant life combined. It's a huge carbon store that when we dig it out of a peat bog, or we drain a peat bog so that we can dig it out to make some potting mix, it can release huge amounts of carbon into the air. Canadian peat harvesting might be sustainable. It's a little hard to tell because it's mostly just the Canadian peat industry giving reports on how sustainable they are. There's not a whole lot of kind of third-party research that I've been able to find. But for seed starting, at least, there's lots of other great options. For some other things, peat is still like the best. But for seed starting, there's lots of other options. My favorite is coir, or also called cocoa fiber sometimes, or coconut fiber sometimes. It's essentially just a waste product from processing coconuts. So it's an agricultural waste product. It's completely biodegradable. It's being produced anyways, and it's mostly just getting burned or thrown in a dump if it's not being used for some other purpose. It's sold loose, kind of like this here on the left. This is actually peat, but coir looks almost exactly the same. So it's sold loose like this sometimes. Kind of the nicest way to get it, if you want a lot, is they sell it compressed in bricks that you can get, and then you kind of wet the brick and it expands like 10 times, 20 times its volume. They also sell it in pellets, like peat pellets, except it's made out of coir. And they also sell it pressed into pots and trays. So like people talk about like peat pots or peat trays. They also make coir pots, same thing. And it isn't hydrophobic and it isn't acidic. So it doesn't need a wetting agent and it doesn't need something to temper its pH. If you want to make your own, this is the mix that I use personally for my seed starting that I like. I use 2 parts coir. This is a picture here. So this is like the brick that I buy. This is actually a quarter of a brick. It's a real big thing that I buy. But this is like a quarter of one. And that quarter, when I wet it, expands into this. So this is a 5-gallon bucket. I think like a half of one of these bricks will like fill a 5-gallon bucket. I think they say on average, it's like one of these full bricks will like fill a wheelbarrow. It's crazy how much it expands. So I do like 2 parts coir, like by volume. Like I'll take like a little scoop or something, 2 scoops of coir. And then I do 1 scoop of compost. And by industrial compost, I mean not necessarily the stuff that you make yourself, but like stuff that you buy at the store or from like St. Louis Composting or from the city. Those tend to be a little better because they're more, they've been heated to a higher temperature. So there's less concerns of any disease that might survive in that compost. And then 1 part either perlite, which is like a mineral that you can buy at pretty much any garden center. It's the stuff that looks kind of like styrofoam beads, but it's not styrofoam. Or rice hulls, which is my preference, which is what this little kind of straw looking thing is in here. You can buy those online as well. And then I like to add a granular slow release fertilizer into the seed starting mix from the get-go so that I don't need to fertilize it later. For containers and trays, whatever container you choose really needs to have drainage holes in it. You really want drainage holes because root rots are one of the biggest issues that you can get with starting seedlings, and root rots are caused by the soil being too wet. And so if you don't have drainage holes, it's more likely that that there will be issues with overwatering, whether you intend to or not. Some of the more common options, other than just pots, because you can just get pots, there are soil blocks or pellets. So the only thing that I like to warn people about with pellets, so this is a picture of pellets once they're expanded, is that little netting that they put around those pellets is plastic. You know, they talk about it like, oh, you just stick it in the ground, and you can, but that's plastic. That netting is never actually going to degrade. It might break down into tiny pieces, but that is plastic. I think they have been working on making some sort of plastic that they claim is biodegradable to replace that netting, but just so you know, it is plastic. You can also make kind of homemade pots. There's lots of instructions online to make pots out of like newspaper or toilet paper rolls, egg cartons, yogurt containers, even eggshells. There's biodegradable pots. So, I mean, there's, you know, things like newspaper and toilet paper rolls. If it's paper egg cartons would also be biodegradable. But there's ones that you can make already, you can purchase already made. So those are like the peat pots. But like I said, they also make them out of core, and they even make ones out of cow poop. We had some a couple of years ago. They don't smell. They've been sterilized. They work just as well as the peat and the core. They're pretty nice. But those are also options. And then you're going to need trays. So the trays is just whatever is going to hold the pot that you're using or the pellets that you're using. So in here, this kind of black container is called a flat. It's just what's used a lot to grow seedlings commercially and grow plants commercially. And it's really good at what it does. There's a reason that it's the standard. But you can also use like anything that'll hold water and that things can sit on. So things like old cookie sheets, cake pans, plates, whatever you got can work for that. So my kind of preferred setup that I use is although if you know me at all, you know I hate plastic. I do like plastic pots because they last forever. They're pretty easy to clean and reuse. They stack pretty nicely, so they're more more space efficient as you're storing them the rest of the year when you're not using them. And because they're easy to clean and reuse, there's less disease issues than if you were using something that was more porous, like a terracotta pot or something like that. So I like the plastic pots that can nest. So I like if there's a pot size that I like, I save it anytime I find an extra one, or I'll talk to other gardeners and tell them to save ones, or if I'm recycling some pots at a pot recycling and I see something, I might grab it. And then I like using flats, again, because they are a nice standard size. Pretty much all pots that are made are designed to fit into this flat size, which is 10 inches by 20 inches. So pretty much any pot you choose is going to fit nicely into these black plastic trays. They stack nicely. Again, they last forever. They're plastic. They're easy to clean. And so those are nice. And then I put a tray under all of those because most of these flats do have holes in the bottom of them as well. And what I have found is a really nice tray is actually dog crate pans. So like those like wire kind of dog cage things that like will fold flat. They sell like big heavy duty black plastic things to put on the bottom of them in case the dog pees or something, I guess. And they come in various different sizes. And there's one size, I don't know if you can kind of see here, that is 20 inches wide. And so these flats fit really nicely into those trays. And they're not terribly expensive, and they're a really thick plastic. Like they should last probably for the rest of my life, I would imagine. So light is another critical thing. So I would say probably the number one thing that I hear from people when they're saying that they tried to do seedlings and it didn't work was that they got leggy, that they got really long, skinny, kind of floppy, weak. So what that is that is a response to a lack of light. When you read stuff online, a huge number of people are just like, put it in a sunny window, And I don't know where those people live, but it is not St. Louis. There are very few plants that if you stick them in a sunny, very few vegetable plants that if you stick them in a sunny window in St. Louis will not get leggy. You know, our summers or our winters are dreary generally. They're usually pretty cloudy. The days are really short, and just because of the angle of the sun is not very intense. And so unless you have like a greenhouse or something that is outside and it can get full sun all day long, they're almost certainly going to get leggy without a supplemental lighting. And that can be any sort of artificial lighting. They sell things that are specifically for growing seedlings, like grow lights. Those are nice, but they tend to be pretty expensive, and the benefit isn't that huge. So if you have other lights sitting around, if you have like LED shop lights sitting, or like fluorescent tube kind of like shop lights sitting around, those work fine. They work great. If you are looking to buy like new lights, they make LED ones now that are specifically for growing, and those are really nice and they last forever. But if you've already got some lights like laying around, or you want like really cheap lights, just like fluorescent tube kind of fixtures that are like $20, work just fine. The only thing to know is that you also, again, because they want really intense light, the sun is really intense in the summer. You want the light to be really close to them. So like this picture here where you can see how close this is. So this is an LED light, and this is one that's, or sorry, fluorescent light that is specifically a grow light. And I still had to have them this close to really prevent them from getting leggy. These look kind of leggy, but they're vines. This is just what they do. But this is how close they had to be to my seedlings. And so because you want them to be that close, it's also nice to have your lights hooked up in some way that you can lift them over time as your plants get taller. That can be really helpful. But I just always like to emphasize that you really, really want a supplemental lighting system of some kind. And the light needs to be much closer than it seems like they should be. The only exception to that is LEDs. LEDs can be further away because the light is much more intense. But if you're buying an LED grow light, it should tell you the distance, but it is further. And I always just like to put this fun fact in here because I just found it out recently that the guy who invented LEDs grew up like 4 blocks from where I grew up in Glen Carbon, Illinois, right across the river from St. Louis. And then developed them while he was a professor at University of Illinois. So LEDs brought to you by St. Louis. But lighting is very important, especially if you've had any issues with your seedlings getting leggy in the past. That is almost certainly what the cause was. So fertility is another big thing that people will miss out on, that will be a cause of some of their issues. So if you are using seed starting mix, which I highly recommend you do, because it's not soil, it doesn't really have any nutrients in it. So the seedlings might like germinate and grow fine for a little bit, and then they'll turn kind of yellow or sluggish or just kind of like die, flop over. That's because there's no food, there's no nutrients in the seed starting mix unless you're adding fertility of some kind. So that's particularly important to know if you are purchasing a seed starting mix, which has no fertility added to it, or if you're using like a peat pellet, which has no fertility added into it. If you do like soil blocks, part of that recipe is adding fertilizers into the soil block, so you don't need to fertilize. That's also why, like in my homemade seed starting mix recipe that I had earlier, like granular slow release fertilizer was in there. That was because there needs to be fertilizer in there. And if you mix it in as you're mixing the seed starting mix, then you don't need to worry about forgetting it later. But if you're purchasing a seed starting mix, you need to be adding a fertilizer. So if you did not add a granular fertilizer before you like filled your pots and planted things into it, usually the best option is a liquid fertilizer. I think there's some granular fertilizers that they say you can put on top. But for seedlings, I'm just not sure how great that works, but you could give it a try. But if you didn't mix it into the seed starting mix, liquid fertilizer is your best option. I like to just add it into my water as I'm watering the seedlings. You can obviously use synthetic fertilizer, something like Miracle Grow. You get a little tiny bottle and it'll last you forever because you add like 3 drops per gallon to fertilize seedlings. But assuming you want an organic option, just because that's what most people want, for seedlings, a mineral based organic fertilizer is best. So there's a lot of like what I would call like biological organic fertilizers. So those are things like fish emulsions or kelp, like kelp extract or blood meal or things like that, that are phenomenal fertilizers, but they're real gross to be spraying on plants in your living room. It can get real nasty, and they can attract gnats real fast. And then you end up with like a living room that smells like fish and blood and there's gnats everywhere. So those fertilizers are real great for outside, but I do not recommend them for inside if it's like in your living space. If you're growing them in like, I don't know, a garage or a greenhouse or something, you know, do what you want. But for inside, I would recommend against that. But there are some organic mineral-based fertilizers. There's one that we sell that we can talk about at the end if people want to know about it, but there's lots of other ones out there if you want an organic option that is not smelly. The only other thing I like to is you do want to just follow the instructions on the fertilizer. And if it does not give specific instructions for like growing seedlings or house plants, I'd like Google around online with that specific fertilizer, see if you can find anyone who has tried it. But generally speaking, you're going to be fertilizing at a much lower concentration than you would be to like fertilize vegetables outside. You can fertilize more frequently, but you don't want to be fertilizing every day. Like if you mix it into your water, don't water them with fertilizer every day. You usually want to do like every other day at most with that. But there should be instructions on most good fertilizers. Some of the more optional things that you might want are things like heat mats and humidity domes. So heat mats are not essential. They're just, it's this picture down here. It's just like a little electronic thing that you plug in and it just produces heat. So you kind of stick that under your flat. They're all designed to fit under a standard flat. And so you just slide that under and it'll produce heat and it'll heat the soil in the pot. And so it will speed the germination of the seed. So again, not essential. It makes things faster. The only things that I would say it might be essential for, especially if you keep your home on the colder side in the winter, is peppers in particular really want warm soil. If you've tried to grow peppers before as seedlings and everything else you grew germinated, but the peppers didn't, it's probably heat. They want the soil to be pretty hot before they germinate. Eggplant are similar, but don't seem to be quite as sensitive as peppers, but they also like hot soil. And so eggplants and peppers in particular respond really well to a heat mat. Really everything responds to a heat mat, but peppers and eggplants in particular are ones that I would say if you're wanting to grow eggplants, and especially if you're wanting to grow peppers, it might be worth the investment. They're not that expensive. Domes are just another way to kind of speed things up. So it's just like a plastic cover. So it's this picture up here that you just set on top of the flat. Again, they're all designed to fit onto a standard flat. And it holds in humidity. So as it's evaporating off of the seed starting mix, it gets trapped in there and then will kind of rain back down, keeps the humidity high. So this can be really helpful to speed germination, especially of really small seeded things that are not planted very deep, because the surface of the soil is what dries out fastest. And so if you have that humidity dome over it to keep that soil surface moist constantly, small things are going to germinate much, much more quickly that way. It can particularly speed germination as well if you have a heat mat, because then it's also helping to hold in the heat. So it's great to throw over like peppers or something, because it's gonna make that heat mat work better, or it's gonna keep the temperature higher with the same amount of heat application. So another question, and this is more just me directing you to a resource that we have. The big question is like, when do you start seedlings? So oftentimes seed packets, or some seed packets might tell you, like good seed packets will usually tell you when to start a seedling. But we do have this chart that we call our planting calendar. It's up on our website, seedstl.org, that we have designed over the years based on our experience, that shows you when to plant things outside, like if you're direct seeding, but it does also show like this little image here. It looks like a little tiny plant in a pot. This is like when we recommend you start seedlings of that crop. And then it shows you, further down, the little like green trowel corresponds with then when you would transplant that seedling outside. So, I mean, we made this resource, so I really like it. I use it for my own garden all the time, and it's free up on our website. So then, now that we've talked about all the materials that you need, kind of the why and everything, the actual like process of how you would start seedlings, you want to prepare your items first. So figure out, how you're going to set up your lights. Do that, get your lights, set them up. If you're reusing pots, it's good to wash them. The like best practice is like wash, like soap and water, like scrub, like in a sink, like you would dishes. That's the best practice to do. And I would recommend that, especially if you had disease issues with whatever was in that pot previously. If there are seedling pots that you've been using for years and you've not had disease issues, you can probably get away with just kind of hosing them out, just spraying them out. It'd probably be fine. But the best practice is to like truly wash them to make sure that you're not going to be carrying any disease from one year to the next. You want to mix your seed starting mix if you're making it. Make sure to add your granular fertilizer to the one you're making, or to store-bought ones as well. If it's like a loose seed starting mix that you're making, I would recommend adding a granular fertilizer to that. And then you want to moisten your seed starting mix before it goes into the pot. Or like if you're doing, pellets or something, you want to expand the pellet before you try and plant something into it. And the moistening them before you put the seeds in is really critical, especially if it's peat based. If it is a peat based seed starting mix and you do not moisten it before you put the seeds in, it is almost certainly not going to work. Because peat just does not like to absorb moisture. You basically have to force it, like literally force it to absorb water. So my preferred way to do it is if you dump it into like a big container, like whether that's a bucket or like a Rubbermaid tote or something that will hold water. Add your seed starting mix and then add water and then like knead it like you would dough. Like with your hands, you're like forcing the water into it. You can just add the water and wait for it to absorb, but like if it's peat based, it might take like an hour or more to do that on its own. And so it is possible, but it's annoying. And so you want to kind of massage that in. You want to start, conservative on the water, and then add more water until you get to kind of the moisture content, kind of the consistency of cake batter. You don't want it to be real runny and soupy. You don't want it to be dry. You want it to be wet. So kind of like a cake batter kind of consistency is what you're looking for in terms of moisture content. And then after it's moistened, fill your pots, and then put your pots onto the trays. Plant your seeds just like you would outside. So the normal, again, almost all seed packets should tell you this information. But the general kind of rule of thumb is that you don't want to plant a seed any deeper than twice its diameter. If you go deeper than that, there's a chance that it's not going to have enough energy to actually push through all the soil. So it's much better to err on the side of planting it too shallow than to plant it too deep. Too deep, like the plant could just die. If it's too shallow, it just means that you need to water it a little more. So, plant your seeds. I usually recommend people plant, a couple seeds per pot. So like 2 or 3 seeds per hole, especially if your seeds are old. If your seeds are, a year or 2 old, it's good to plant a couple seeds so that at least one of them will germinate. If it's like brand new seed and you want to grow as many plants as possible, putting 1 seed in there is fine. But if you get one that doesn't germinate, you might need to reseed that pot. And this is also critical. You want to label the seedling with when you plant the seed. A lot of them look identical when they are young. Like brassicas, like when we're talking about cauliflower, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, kale, collards, kohlrabi. those are all the exact same species. So when they're little, they look exactly the same because they are the same. It's only like as they get older that they start to look different. So if you care to know like what each of these things are for when you're transplanting them outside, you really, really, really want to label them because it's very difficult to tell the difference when they are young. So you want to label them with something that is not going to wash off as you're watering. So, whether that's like a piece of plastic that you write with like a waterproof marker or like a lead pencil, like China, what do they call them? China pencils, I think it's something, or like a grease pen or something. There's lots of different things you can look at, but you want something that is not going to wash off onto a label of some kind into your pots. And then you want to water your seedlings as soon as you plant them. I highly recommend that you do something that is a very gentle waterer because that seed starting mix is very loose. And so if you are hitting it with like a watering can, the seed starting mix might just wash all over the place and your seeds might get unburied. They might actually wash to the next pot. I've had that happen when I've watered too aggressively. So if you just have a couple seedlings, just like a little like hand spray bottle is fine. I use one of these, like one of these big pump sprayers that people use to spray herbicides and stuff. I bought a brand new one, so there's nothing in it. You don't want to use one that's been used. I bought just like a brand new one. It was like 10 bucks. I put the water in there, you pump it up, and then you can spray a whole bunch of seedlings in one go. When the seedlings are bigger, once they're kind of more mature, you can use more of like a watering can or something because the roots are big enough that they're kind of holding that that seed starting mix in place. But a nice gentle waterer is really nice to have. You then want to put your tray, after you water them, you then want to put your trays under your grow lights. You do not need to turn on your grow lights until after the seeds have sprouted. You can turn them on before then, but you're just kind of wasting electricity. It's not doing anything. And it will dry out the seed starting mix faster. So it actually makes more work for you to do that. But once the seeds have germinated, like once they've sprouted, once the first little green thing pops up, you want to have those lights on. If you are using heat mats, you want to put that heat mat under the tray, as soon as you put the tray down, and you want to turn it on as soon as you plant the stuff. You can leave it on the whole time that you're growing the seedling, and the plant will probably appreciate that. But once the plant has germinated, you can, if you need to, unplug it and move it to another tray if there's something else that you're trying to get germinated and you're limited on the number of heat mats. That's what I think. I have like one heat mat, and so I kind of stagger and I move it from one tray to the next because I only have so many outlets that I'm willing to to devote to all of this stuff. If you're going to use a humidity dome, you want to put the dome over the tray as soon as you set it on, under the light. And you want to remove it as soon as the seed has sprouted. Because if you leave it on there once the seed has sprouted, that really high humidity environment that creates can actually encourage fungal disease in the sprouted plant. So you want to leave it on there while it's still trying to germinate, but once it is germinated, it's not really very useful anymore. So for ongoing maintenance, and once you've actually set everything up, what are you doing from day to day? They need to be watered. It's hard to give you a specific of how often. I know people always like a hard and fast number. You need to water as often as needed to keep the medium surface moist. Particularly when they're young, like before they have germinated and when they're really little. When they're like older, if it dries out for a little bit, it's not that big of a deal because they have roots that are going down to the bottom of the pot that might still be moist. But you need to water it pretty often. I mean, like a minimum of every day. But oftentimes in those early stages, once they've germinated and the lights are on, but the plants are still really little, you might be needing to water, once in the morning and once kind of in the evening. It really depends on kind of the lights that you have, how warm it is in your house, how big the pots are, all those different things. If you did not add a granular fertilizer to your seed starting mix, you will need to be doing the liquid fertilizer. You will want to start that once the first true leaves have grown. So most plants, when they first sprout, they've got two little leaves that don't look like the adult plant at all. So those are called cotyledons. So those are not the true leaves. But then you'll start getting, another leaf that'll shoot up from that then looks like, oh, that's kale, or that's, cabbage, or that's a tomato or whatever. So once that emerges, that's when you need to start fertilizing. And then, like it says here, no more than every other day in terms of fertilization. You don't want to be adding fertilizer every single day if you're doing a liquid fertilizer. The lights should be on between 12 and 16 hours a day. Longer will kind of make them grow faster, but it's, also with whatever works with your life. But 12 is kind of the minimum that you want to shoot for in terms of length. You don't want to leave them on 24 hours a day, because plants they are triggered by the sun coming up and down, just like our bodies are. Like melatonin is released when the sun goes down. Like plants also have kind of hormonal and chemical signals that go on that are triggered by the day. So you do want it to be turned on and off. You can do that manually. You can also buy a timer. They're pretty cheap, and have it turn off and on at the exact same time without you having to worry about it, which is really nice if you are able to do that. Airflow is another thing that's important. Because you're watering them so frequently, because the soil is moist, because they're all kind of packed into this little space, you do have a pretty high moisture environment. And because you're inside, it's generally pretty low airflow. Most of our homes, especially in the winter time, we don't have fans blowing all over the place. We like our air to be pretty stale in our buildings, for good or bad. And so that means that right around those plants, it's a very high humidity environment. So having some airflow, if you have a little fan that kind of gently blows over your seedlings, that can help kind of keep the airflow moving, which can help avoid some fungal diseases and some issues with things like gnats. That fan can also take care of agitation for you, or you can do that manually. And that is just, the plants growing inside when there's no airflow. The plant's like, why would I waste energy making a strong stem if my stem's never getting hit with anything? And so the airflow, if it's blowing on the plant and they're blowing back and forth, the plant is going to create a nice strong stem for you. If you don't have a fan blowing directly on plants, you can do, just in this picture here, this is me just with some seedlings, where you just rub your hand over it, just kind of bend the plants back and forth a little bit, and that'll trigger that same reaction in the seedlings to strengthen the stem, so that when you move them outside, they don't just kind of flop over in the first storm you have. Thinning is something that you're going to need to do almost certainly at some point if you planted more than one seed per pot. And that's just when you have a pot that more than one thing germinated in, like in this one here. You can see there's one there that we kept, and then there's this little stem here. This is just when you're removing any stem that's an additional one. You only want one per pot. So once they've germinated, I usually say once at least that first true leaf comes out. So this is a good example here in this picture. So these two are not true leaves. So these are cotyledons. But then it gets this third leaf that you can kind of see has got more ridges to it. So this is kale. And over here you can see it. So that's the true leaf. So once you get ones that have at least one true leaf, I usually wait a little longer just because I'm lazy. You want to remove all the additional plants per pot so that you just have the one that is the healthiest, the strongest, the biggest, whichever one looks the best. And it is best to cut those at the soil surface. This is really too high. You want to cut that right at the soil surface. It's best not to pull them out, because if you pull them out, you might accidentally pull out the one that you don't want just by uprooting it, or you might damage the roots of that one. So just cutting it is the best way to do that. And almost all vegetable seedlings, little things, are edible. And so you've then just harvested some microgreens for yourself. So then the kind of the last question, or the other big question, is when is it time to plant outside? So the first thing that I always recommend is to check your planting calendar. If you have one yourself, or if you want to check our planting calendar on our website, that's what I use. And that should give you an indication of at least generally when they should go outside. You also just kind of want to know if they're big enough. If you're oh, I could transplant it now, but it's still a little small, well, then leave it inside for another week. Let it get a little bigger, and then work on moving it outside. A week or two is not going to be the end of the world. You don't want to stick a little itty bitty plant out there. It's gonna be much harder than if the plant has some good size to it. A good general rule is that you want like at least 4 true leaves. So these are brassicas. I think this is like a cabbage. So you can see there's like 1, 2, 3, 4 kind of like big leaves, and then you can see these 2 little cotyledons down here at the base. So this is a good size to transplant a cabbage. You can see these ones down here, like these are all about the size that you would ideally be looking for. If your plants are looking big, if they're like kind of getting crowded in the pots, like these down here, where they're like running into each other, and you've still got, like more than a week or 2 until it's time to plant them outside, you really want to probably up pot them. And so that's where you're just transplanting it into a larger pot. That's all that is. So you're just taking it, moving it into a bigger pot so that it has more space, so that it's not going to get root bound. Because if it gets root bound in those pots, it's going to slow down its vigor, so that when you transplant it outside, it's not going to grow as fast. So up potting is not something that is strictly speaking, that is like universally necessary. There is no plant that you like have to up pot. It strictly has to do with the size of the plant and when it's time to plant it outside. So the last critical step, and this is another big thing that people will run into when they are growing seedlings at home, is that they did not harden them off. So what that means is that it's just a process of getting plants used to life outside. So life inside is pretty cushy. It's why we spend so much money and energy building inside, is because it's nice inside. Life is easy inside. You don't get big temperature fluctuations. It's not windy. It's not really sunny and then really cold and dark at night. And so the plants are used to that inside. And so if you just then throw them outside and they're like, you live outside 24/7 now, it's a big shock to those plants. And sometimes they just die. They just can't handle it. And so the best way to deal with that is, again, this process called hardening off, which is where usually over the course of about a week, you kind of gently get them used to being outside. It can be kind of a pain. It can be kind of a lot of work. But it is worth doing. And that is where you are taking your potted things outside for like a couple hours the first day, usually kind of in the afternoon in not direct sun, ideally, to get them just kind of used to like, oh, this temperature is different. It's kind of windy, it's stuff. And then you bring them back inside. And then the next day you do the same thing, but you leave them outside for a little bit longer. And then you do that a little longer, a little longer, a little longer. And then also moving them to kind of a brighter spot. So for me personally, I do that with my seedlings, where I have like an area, I have like a deck that it's like kind of shades the area. And the first day I put them, and it's like pretty much full shade outside, but it's in the middle of the day, like when it's the hottest and it's windy. And then like over the course of the week, I kind of move them to where they're getting a little bit more sun. And usually by the end of the week, like they're just outside all day long, and then they just live out there until I'm able to get them in my garden, which is usually pretty quick after I harden them off. So just real quick, I'll just mention these. So they're, again, not seedlings in the classic sense, but you can also grow your own kind of sweet potato seedlings. They're not little like potted plants usually, although you can do that. Growing a sweet potato slip is just where you're taking a sweet potato and you're kind of suspending it in a glass of water, where you can see it's like, half in water, half out of water. You just like shove some toothpicks in it, and after a while they'll start sprouting, and then you just break those sprouts off once they get like 6 to 8 inches long. And then I usually stick them in a glass of water until they start growing roots. You can see in this picture these roots that are growing here. And then once they have roots, if it's time to transplant them outside, you can transplant them outside. Or you can put them into little pots and make them like little seedlings until it is time to put them outside. In terms of when to start the sweet potato slips, I honestly cannot give you a good date. I feel like it varies a lot from person to person. Like everybody I talk to starts them at a different time. I usually, if I'm going to do sweet potato slips, which I don't do every year, I usually am starting them now, because I feel like for me, they take a long time. And that might just be because I keep my apartment real cold in the winter. We just have a real drafty area. And so they take a long time to sprout. I know other people that are like, oh, they sprout right away. So I think generally speaking, kind of the more light, the more heat you have, the faster they will sprout, and kind of the later you can start them. But if you have kind of a colder area, you want to start them earlier. And then some other things that are not like kind of classic, seed grown things. This one is like a real weird one, but there are some like perennial kales out there that I've had some luck with, particularly from this place called Experimental Farm Network. They sell them as seeds. You grow them like you would a normal kale seedling, but then once they get growing, if you find one that you like, because it's like a really diverse population and they're not all great here, you can take cuttings of those, and they're pretty easy to just like cut off a piece of stem, stick it into a pot, get it to root, and then kind of propagate it that way. But for the most part, most vegetables are not propagated by cuttings. Potatoes are propagated from a potato that you just like cut into pieces, and then you stick in the ground. So you're not starting those in pots inside. It's just not really a thing with potatoes. And then like things like garlics, shallots, elephant garlic, you're planting the individual cloves in the ground. You're not doing like little seedling transplants or anything like that. So I'm happy to answer questions, but just these are some upcoming classes that we have that we'll be teaching. I'm teaching some of them. Jackson, the other guy on here, will be teaching some of them. And then for the conference that's coming up in March, I think Jackson and I will both be teaching classes at that. And then we also have quite a few outside speakers that will be coming in for that conference as well. So, yeah.
Right. So we do have a couple questions, or a couple of the same question. So some people were asking about the granular fertilizer you use. I don't know if you mentioned it on the slide, or if you went by it real quick, if you have a specific brand or type you use.
So the type that I use is one that that we sell, that Seed St. Louis sells, called green soil fertilizer. I'm sure it's also sold somewhere else in St. Louis because it's a St. Louis based company that makes it. But it's I like that fertilizer particularly because it's not a water soluble fertilizer, it's an acid soluble fertilizer, which is kind of weird, but it basically means that it can't burn your plants. So you don't need to worry as much about like, ooh, did I add too much? It's virtually impossible to add too much of it. So I really like that one. And it's also just a really slow releasing one. So that's the one that I like. I've seen some other ones that people use, like there's ones that they're like little granular pellets that are like made from manure, but they don't smell because they're like slow release somehow, that I have met some people that use. I'm not sure what the brand of that was. But that green soil fertilizer is the one that I like. And it's like a white powder. It's a really weird texture. It's actually, the company is based in St. Louis, but it's derived from ocean water. So obviously the plant isn't here. And so it's got like it's a really broad spectrum fertilizer, which is nice.
All right. Another people were asking about where to get the core, the coconut core.
So I usually order mine just on Amazon. I think in the past, just because it was really hard to find locally. I have started noticing it at a couple like local garden centers. Like I think Rolling Ridge might have some. I'm sure Greenscape has some, although I haven't checked there. But I use a lot of it, and so I was buying this like massive brick on Amazon. But I've been seeing a lot more ones that are like the size of like a brick, like a standard brick, at places. I think I've even seen them a couple times at like Lowe's and Home Depot. But if you're not able to find it at a local nursery, you could just like Google core, like compressed core brick, and you should find it.
I know there was a couple questions kind of, if you're kind of just starting out with seedlings the first time, do you have any specific plants you recommend?
Ooh, I think in my opinion, like for me, I think the ones that are the easiest tend to be the brassicas. I think the brassicas are pretty easy, like those, cabbage, kale, collards, cauliflower, broccoli. If you find a variety that you like and you actually want to eat, I think those tend to be the easiest ones that are like also helpful to grow as seedlings. Tomatoes also tend to be pretty easy. I feel like the like onions and leeks are a little harder and they need to be started a lot earlier. Herbs I find to be a lot more finicky. And then peppers and eggplants are easy to grow if you have a heat mat. So, but the brassicas I think are the easiest.
Let's do like one more question. Oh man, we got quite a bit.
I was saying I'm happy to answer questions if people want.
So some people were asking about sunflowers, marigolds, other flowers to start from seed. I know I usually just do it from seeds instead of a seedling.
Yeah. Yeah, I think marigolds are kind of is like one of the few that I've seen where it might make sense just because they are a little slower growing when they're young, I think. I know there are people who do sunflowers. I personally don't think it's a good idea to do sunflowers as seedlings. Sunflowers are super drought tolerant. They're from like the Great Plains, and the reason that they're drought tolerant is they have a really big taproot. And so growing them as a seedling kind of disrupts that, and it can make them a little stunted, a little more liable to blow over in a storm. So I don't like those as seedlings. I know some people will do like zinnias. I'm sure you can do that. It's just one of those that seems unnecessary. They usually do really well direct seeding. So
yeah, I found when I've done zinnias by seedling, even with like, and they're in the same thing as like tomatoes that don't get leggy, the zinnias still kind of get leggy. And they're just, yeah, they grow so fast once the weather's nice.
Yeah.
Okay. Seedling. I'm trying to type these out while going through it too, so I'm trying to figure out which ones to answer. Somebody was asking about using egg cartons as a container. Do you find that is it deep enough for seedlings? I've never used them.
I mean, they're definitely not they would definitely not be my first choice. But if it's what you got and it's what you can use, I would say it is doable. But your plants are not, you're not going to be able to you're probably not going to be able to get to that like nice big size that I was showing, like of the like cabbages and stuff of like, this is like the ideal size. They're probably just not going to be able to get that big because of that smaller size, which isn't the end of the world. You might just be transplanting smaller things. Or I mean, it could be a good kind of first step, and then know that you're going to up pot into a bigger pot inside. So yeah, it's doable, but if you want a real big seedling, it's probably not going to work.
Yeah, I think that we have a couple other questions with kind of similar stuff, and it's like, yeah, it's sometimes you might have to up pot, or you're just planting, a smaller seedling, but like having them too crowded is the problem usually.
Yeah, and I would say like for pot size too, let me see if I can find a good picture of like, it's hard to see in here, but like there's these like tray insert things, like this one on the left. Like I bought a couple years ago, I just finally was like, I'm gonna buy some of these, that it's like the whole thing, it's like all in one. And these are like, they're cells, but they're like, this one's like really deep, but I have some that are smaller. And I really like these. I mean, they did cost a couple bucks to buy, but like considering that I can use them to grow seedlings that I don't have to then pay for the seedling, and you can reuse them year after year. I really liked these. But I do also use like pots like this if it's something where I need to get like a bigger pot. And these are just ones, you can see they're all different colors. These are just ones that I've accumulated over the years from buying herb seedlings or random things. So
here's a really good question actually about those decomposable, like those pots that can break down apparently when you plant them in the ground. Have you found that they do?
Not really. I mean, so the ones that do break down, I mean, are usually peat, or core, like it's one of those materials. So they are like, they will, like, I mean, it's not like you're not littering, like it's not like you're putting plastic or or anything in there. Like it is like a biological substance that will decompose. But I have never seen where like, oh, you stick it in and by fall they've disappeared. Like, I mean, the pieces are still there. So definitely if you're gonna transplant those in, I still usually pull them out of the pot and then I compost and I like throw the pot in my compost bin, or at least rip the bottom off of the pot. Because if you just stick the whole pot in there, especially if it's peat, if you get like a drought in your garden and that pot dries out, the roots then can't really push through that pot. So
a couple people are asking about just, let's do this as the last one. Just temperature, if you don't have a heat mat, is there a temperature that you're trying to keep them at, or really more to be worried about if it's too cold?
Oh, that is a great question, and I do not have a good answer for that. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, for like your cool season stuff, like your brassicas and things like that, they're pretty tough. If it's a livable temperature for you inside, the brassicas are going to be fine. But if you're talking about like tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, like basil, like things that are like warm season, you do want warm. But yeah, I don't have a real good temperature. I mean, it'd probably at least be in the 60s.
I think 60s is 70.
But yeah, like for peppers especially, probably more into the 70s.
Yeah, if you're not using a heat mat with germinating pepper seeds, it's going to be a challenge. And really, I found even with tomatoes, the ones I haven't put them on heat mats.
Oh, okay.
I also do it in a basement. So.
Oh, yeah, that's colder.
Yeah.
Peppers especially, I would say, like unless your house is real hot, you really probably want a heat mat. I have had a little bit more luck with tomatoes in cooler temperatures, but I am also using like pretty hot lights that are pretty close, so maybe that's helping. But yeah, pretty warm for warm season crops.
All right. Well, I'm gonna